What happens when someone walks into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom and forgets who they're standing in front of? This man was about to learn. Some judges don't just hand out fines, they hand out lessons that stay with you for life. It started like any ordinary hearing until the defendant snapped. He stood up, face flushed with anger, eyes blazing, voice echoing through the chamber. "You old fool," he shouted. "You don't know what you're talking about." The room froze. You could hear a pin drop. Every clerk stopped typing. The bailiff's hand hovered over his radio, and Judge Caprio just sat there, still as stone. Slowly, he removed his glasses, placed them on the bench, and looked up, not with fury, but with a calm that could silence a storm. What he said next would leave the entire courtroom speechless, and what happened in the next 60 seconds would go down as the most unforgettable moment in Providence courtroom history. Because in that room, on that morning, a man didn't just get judged, he got educated. It was a Tuesday morning in Providence Municipal Court, and Judge Frank Caprio was handling what seemed like a routine traffic violation case. The defendant, Michael Romano, a 45-year-old contractor from Federal Hill, had been cited for running a red light at the intersection of Atwells Avenue and Dean Street. The fine was standard, $85 plus court costs. Nothing unusual about it. Romano had requested a hearing, claiming the light was malfunctioning. He'd brought what he called evidence, a blurry cell phone video that proved absolutely nothing. Judge Caprio had seen thousands of these cases. He knew the intersection well, knew the timing of those lights, and knew when someone was trying to game the system.
"Mr. Romano," Judge Caprio said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the citation. "I've looked at your video, and I have to tell you, it doesn't show what you think it shows." That's when Romano's demeanor changed. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. The respectful facade he'd maintained for the first few minutes of the hearing crumbled completely. "What do you mean it doesn't show anything?" Romano snapped, his voice rising above the acceptable courtroom level. "That light was broken. I'm not paying some Fine, because you can't see straight." The courtroom stirred. Judge Caprio's clerk, Maria Santos, looked up from her paperwork with concern. The bailiff, Officer Tony Reishi, straightened in his chair, hand instinctively moving closer to his radio. In 30 years of working these courtrooms, they'd seen defendants get frustrated, but something about Romano felt different, more volatile. Nobody in that courtroom knew they were about to witness Judge Caprio deliver the most devastating verbal takedown in Providence judicial history. Judge Caprio remained calm, his voice steady but firm. "Mr. Romano, I need you to lower your voice and show proper respect for this court." But Romano was past the point of reason. The stress of his failing construction business, his recent divorce, his mounting bills, it all came pouring out in a torrent of misplaced rage directed at the one person in that room who held all the power. "Respect?" Romano laughed bitterly, standing up despite not being given permission. "You want me to respect you, you old fool? You don't know what you're talking about. You sit up there in your fancy robe looking down on working people like me, acting like you're some kind of god." The silence that followed was deafening.
Maria Santos stopped typing. Officer Ricci stood up, ready to intervene. The handful of people in the gallery, other defendants waiting their turn, a few court watchers, a local reporter who'd come to cover routine municipal business, all held their breath. Judge Caprio slowly removed his glasses. He set them down on his desk with deliberate precision. When he looked up, his eyes held something that made even Officer Ricci pause. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. And somehow that was far more intimidating. "Mr. Romano," Judge Caprio said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You just made the biggest mistake of your day." Possibly your year. Romano, still riding his wave of misguided indignation, doubled down. What are you going to do, old man? Give me a bigger fine? I'm not afraid of you. That's when Judge Caprio did something that no one in that courtroom expected. He smiled. Not a warm smile, not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed an opportunity to deliver a masterclass in respect, authority, and the consequences of poor choices. Officer Ricci, Judge Caprio said, never taking his eyes off Romano, would you please escort Mr. Romano to holding? He's going to need some time to think about his approach to addressing this court. Wait, what? Romano's bravado cracked. You can't arrest me. I didn't do anything illegal. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, completely in control. Actually, Mr. Romano, what you just did is called contempt of court. Is a very real charge with very real consequences. But we're going to start with something simpler. The judge picked up his pen and began writing. The scratching of ink on paper was the only sound in the courtroom. Your original fine was $85.
Judge Caprio continued, still writing. However, given your behavior today, I'm imposing additional penalties. Contempt of court, $500. Disorderly conduct in a courtroom, $300. And because you questioned my competence and suggested I don't understand the law, Judge Caprio looked up, making direct eye contact with Romano, who was now visibly sweating. I'm ordering you to complete 40 hours of community service. Specifically, you'll be working with the Providence Parks Department, cleaning up the very intersections where people like you think they can ignore traffic laws. You'll report to Supervisor Martinez next Monday at 6 a.m. sharp. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Romano's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. What he said next would be shared on social media thousands of times and become a defining moment of courtroom justice. Mr. Romano, Judge Caprio continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his 30-plus years on the bench. You came into my courtroom today thinking you were going to intimidate an old judge into dismissing your ticket. You thought if you got loud enough, aggressive enough, disrespectful enough, I'd just give up and let you walk. Judge Caprio stood up, his black robe making him appear even more imposing, despite his modest 5'7" frame. Let me tell you something about respect, son. It's not something you demand, something you earn. And today, you've earned the opposite. You've shown everyone in this courtroom exactly the kind of person you are when you think you can get away with it. Romano tried to interrupt, but Judge Caprio held up a hand, and the authority in that gesture was undeniable. I've been on this bench for over 3 decades. I've seen thousands of people come through that door. Some are having the worst day of their lives. Some made honest mistakes. Some are struggling with problems bigger than a traffic ticket. And you know what? I try to show compassion for those people because we're all human beings trying to get through life. The judge's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But you, Mr. Romano, you didn't come here struggling with life's problems. You came here with arrogance. You came here thinking the rules don't apply to you. You came here ready to abuse anyone who dared to hold you accountable for your actions. Before moving forward, subscribe to Case Closed and hit that notification bell, because what Judge Caprio said next completely destroyed this man's arrogance and showed everyone the true meaning of justice. You called me an old fool, Judge Caprio continued, now walking around to the front of his bench, getting closer to Romano. But let me ask you something, Mr. Romano. How foolish is it to run a red light and endanger other people's lives? How foolish is it to lie about it when you get caught? How foolish is it to come into a court of law and think you can bully your way out of consequences? Romano's face had gone from red to pale. The swagger was completely gone. Now, you know what's really foolish, Mr. Romano? thinking that disrespecting a judge is going to improve your situation, thinking that volume makes up for validity, thinking that insults are stronger than integrity. Judge Caprio paused, letting his words sink in. I want you to understand something. When you walked into this courtroom today, you had options. You could have been respectful, accepted responsibility for your actions, maybe even explained your financial situation if the fine was a hardship. I've worked with people on payment plans. I've reduced fines for people going through tough times. I've dismissed cases when people showed genuine remorse and understanding. The judge returned to his seat, his point made. But you chose none of those options. You chose aggression. You chose disrespect. You chose to make this personal. Well, congratulations, Mr. Romano. You got my personal attention. Now you get to live with the personal consequences. Romano finally found his voice, but it was small and shaky. Your Honor, I didn't mean— Oh, but you did mean it, Judge Caprio interrupted. You meant every word. You thought about insulting me, and you did it. You thought about showing disrespect for this court, and you did it. You thought about trying to intimidate someone you perceived as an obstacle to getting what you wanted, and you did it. The judge leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. The difference between you and the hundreds of other people I see every month is that they understand something fundamental about how the world works. Actions have consequences. Behavior has consequences. Respect is reciprocal. But Judge Caprio wasn't done teaching this lesson. The final blow was about to be delivered, and it would leave Romano questioning every arrogant decision he'd ever made. Mr. Romano, I'm going to do something for you that nobody else in your life has apparently done. I'm going to hold you accountable, not just for the traffic violation, but for your character. Judge Caprio picked up a legal pad and began writing again. In addition to your fines and community service, I'm ordering you to attend anger management classes 12 weeks, once per week at your own expense. You'll provide proof of completion to this court, or you'll face additional penalties. Romano's shoulders sagged. The financial reality was hitting him. But here's the part that's really going to hurt, Judge Caprio continued. I'm also ordering you to write a letter of apology. Not to me. I don't need your apology. I want you to write a letter to your children, explaining why their father was held in contempt of court today. I want you to explain to them what you did wrong and what you learned from it. The emotional impact of this hit Romano harder than any fine could have. His eyes began to well up. You see, Mr. Romano, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a person who made bad choices today. But your children are watching. If they have children, someday they'll be watching too. The way you handle authority, the way you respond to being held accountable, the way you treat people who are just doing their jobs, all of that gets passed down. Judge Caprio's voice softened slightly, but the authority remained. Do you want your kids to think it's okay to insult people when they don't get their way? Do you want them to learn that volume and aggression are acceptable substitutes for reason and respect? Do you want them to grow up thinking the rules don't apply to them? Romano was crying now, not from anger or frustration, but from shame and the sudden realization of what he'd become in that moment. I didn't think, Romano whispered. No, you didn't think, Judge Caprio agreed. And that's exactly the problem. You reacted instead of thinking. You attacked instead of communicating. You demanded instead of requesting. The judge stood up one final time. Here's what's going to happen now, Mr. Romano. Officer Ricci is going to escort you downstairs where you'll be processed for contempt. You'll be released in a few hours. but you'll have plenty of time to think about this conversation. When you get home tonight, you're going to look at your children and decide what kind of man you want to be. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to see what real accountability looks like. Because Judge Caprio's final words to this man will stay with you long after you stop watching. Your total fines are now $885, Judge Caprio announced. Your community service starts Monday. Your anger management classes begin next week. I'll have my clerk provide you with approved providers. And your letter to your children is due back to this court within 30 days. Romano nodded, completely defeated, but somehow also relieved. The weight of his arrogance had been lifted, replaced by the burden of accountability, which strangely felt lighter. "Mr. Romano," Judge Caprio said as Officer Ricci approached to escort him out, "I hope you understand that everything I've done today is designed to help you become a better person. The man who walked into this courtroom today isn't the man your children deserve as a father, but the man who might walk out of here after some reflection. He could be." As Romano was led away, the courtroom remained silent for several moments. The reporter in the gallery was scribbling notes frantically. The other defendants waiting their turn looked at each other with new understanding of exactly what kind of judge they were about to face. Judge Caprio returned to his seat, put his glasses back on, and looked at his docket. "Next case," he said simply, as if he hadn't just delivered one of the most comprehensive demonstrations of judicial authority and wisdom anyone in that room had ever witnessed. Maria Santos called the next case, but everyone was still processing what they'd just seen. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It was about respect, accountability, and the power of a judge who understood that real justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. 3 weeks later, Romano would return to that same courtroom. He'd completed his first anger management session, started his community service, and brought a handwritten letter addressed to his 2 teenage children. Judge Caprio read it privately in his chambers and made a note in Romano's file. "Defendant shows genuine remorse and understanding. Case demonstrates successful intervention." But that Tuesday morning, as Romano was led away to holding, all anyone knew was that they'd witnessed something extraordinary. They'd seen a man's arrogance completely dismantled by a judge who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a courtroom isn't the gavel, it's the truth, delivered with unwavering authority and unexpected compassion. Judge Caprio picked up the next file, adjusted his glasses, and prepared to show the same fairness and firmness to whoever walked through his courtroom door next. Because that's what real leaders do. They hold the line, they maintain standards, and they never let anyone mistake their kindness for weakness. The furious man who'd insulted Judge Caprio had indeed paid the price, but in ways he never expected, and in ways that would ultimately make him a better person. But the story doesn't end there. What happened next would prove that Judge Caprio's approach to justice creates ripple effects far beyond his courtroom. 2 months later, Michael Romano returned to Judge Caprio's courtroom for his final check-in. He looked like a completely different person. Gone was the angry, defiant man who had stormed out in handcuffs. In his place stood someone who carried himself with quiet dignity,
Head up, shoulders back, but without the aggressive posture that had defined his first appearance. "Mr. Romano," Judge Caprio said, reviewing the file, "I see you've completed your anger management classes, finished your community service, and submitted your letter. Tell me, how has this experience changed you?" Romano stood up, his hands clasped respectfully in front of him. "Your Honor, I need to tell you something. That day I came in here, I was angry at everyone except the person who deserved it most, myself. My business was failing because I was treating customers the way I treated you. My marriage ended because I couldn't take responsibility for my mistakes. The courtroom was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than 2 months ago. This time, it was respectful attention. "When you made me write that letter to my kids," Romano continued, his voice steady but emotional, "I had to confront what kind of example I was setting. My 15-year-old son told me he was embarrassed to tell his friends what happened to his dad. That hit harder than any fine you could have given me." Judge Caprio nodded, listening intently. "But here's the thing, Your Honor. My son also said he was proud of me for taking responsibility and trying to change. He said, most adults just make excuses, but I was actually doing something about my problems." Romano paused, collecting himself. "During my community service, cleaning those intersections, I met other people working off their penalties. Some were bitter, just counting down the hours. But I started seeing it differently. Every piece of trash I picked up, every corner I cleaned, I was thinking about respect. Respect for the community, respect for the law, respect for the people who have to live and work in
These neighborhoods. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, genuinely interested in what Romano was saying. "The anger management classes taught me something crucial," Romano went on. "I learned that my anger wasn't really about you or the ticket or even my problems. It was about feeling powerless. But you know what real power is? It's choosing your response instead of just reacting. It's taking responsibility instead of blaming others." The transformation was remarkable. The man who had called Judge Caprio an old fool was now demonstrating more emotional intelligence than many people twice his age. "Your Honor, I came back today not just because it was required, but because I wanted to thank you. You could have just thrown me in jail and moved on to the next case. Instead, you took the time to teach me something about myself that I desperately needed to learn." Judge Caprio removed his glasses. But this time, it wasn't in preparation for delivering a harsh lesson. It was a gesture of genuine emotion. "Mr. Romano, what you've just told me is exactly why I became a judge. It's not about punishment for punishment's sake. It's about helping people become better versions of themselves." The judge stood up, something he rarely did during routine proceedings. "You know, in 30 years on this bench, I've seen thousands of people make mistakes, but I've only seen a few hundred take real responsibility for those mistakes. And I've seen maybe a few dozen truly transform themselves because of it. Today, you've joined a very select group." Judge Caprio looked out at the gallery, addressing not just Romano, but everyone present. "This is what accountability looks like. This is what growth looks like. Mr. Romano didn't just pay his fines and complete his requirements. He used this experience
as a catalyst for becoming a better father, a better businessman, and a better member of his community." The judge returned his attention to Romano. "I'm dismissing all remaining penalties and closing your case. But more than that, I'm going to ask you to consider something. Would you be willing to speak to other defendants about your experience? Not as part of any formal program, but simply as someone who's been where they are and found a way forward." Romano's eyes lit up with purpose. "Your Honor, I'd be honored to do that. If my story helps even one person avoid the mistakes I made, then everything I went through was worth it." And it did. Months later, Michael Romano became something unexpected, an ambassador of accountability inside the Providence Municipal Court. He'd sit quietly in the gallery during busy sessions, and every now and then, Judge Caprio would glance his way, then call him forward. "Michael," he'd say, "why don't you talk to this young man?" And just like that, a former defendant became a mentor. The ripple effect was real. His construction business began to recover, built this time not on contracts, but on character. His relationship with his kids grew stronger. He even opened his heart again, dating with the emotional maturity that came from learning the hardest way possible, that respect isn't given, it's earned.
Judge Caprio didn't just waive a ticket that day. He rewired a life. Because his courtroom isn't just a place where justice is handed down. It's a classroom where people learn who they could still become. Michael's fine was $85, but the education he received in accountability, humility, and hope was priceless. That's the legacy Judge Frank Caprio leaves behind. Not laws rewritten,
But lives rewritten. And as long as people like Michael keep passing that lesson forward, his influence will never fade. This is Case Closed, where real stories remind us that justice doesn't end with a sentence, it begins with a second chance. Before you go, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And make sure to subscribe so Judge Caprio's legacy of kindness and redemption never fades into silence.